Today, since individuals in society are having trouble controlling behavior, and we see a flood of advice from people that share their wisdom and mimicry of wisdom, we're in the right mind to ask, what could be done to not let the hell loose completely? Stanley Kubrick's film, Clockwork Orange, made in 1971 and based on Anthony Bourdain's novel, shows an answer which is based on effective behavioral engineering, to say the least. Who else can show us what drives our behavior other than utilitarian and functionalistic American theories? What other school than behaviorism, which managed to dismiss mental processes in psychology for nearly half a century? This film is about a hooligan, Alex, who gets arrested for killing a woman because his droogs, friends with whom he was committing crimes, betray him. Alex's psychopathy at first is reflected through acts of violence and lasciviousness. His violence and promiscuity were combated in the film through behavioristic principles, which are based on shaping human behavior through environmental associations. Now, someone who looks to reveal images and see them as they really are might look at symbols and seek to understand what each symbol means in the film through observing abstractions. For example, the milk bar as the representation of nurturing and lasciviousness, the phallus as a creative principle and driving force, but also in the context of the film as potential for tyranny. Merging of violence and lasciviousness with Beethoven, which connects Europeans through high spirits. The snake symbolism as chaos within which there's potential order, or the prison as an order within which there is chaos. Masks as innocence.
What do I owe this extreme pleasure, sir? Anything wrong, sir?
But also as violence. All these symbols have an abstract and dualistic nature, which makes it hard to point to an actual known fact. This unknowingness associated with a symbol is expressed in Carl Gustav Jung's works. A symbol always presupposes that the chosen expression is the best possible description or formulation of a relatively unknown fact, which is nonetheless known to exist or is postulated as existing. Thus, when the badge of a railway official is explained as a symbol, it amounts to saying that this man has something to do with an unknown system that cannot be differently or better expressed than by a winged wheel. Symbolic interpretations are mostly based on psychodynamic theories. Through their lens, we could go on talking about various aspects of symbolism, where historically it was seen and how it reflects psychological and social structures and functions. But in the spirit of a behaviorist, let's see what they actually represent. For example, Skinner positions symbols in relation to resemblance. A symbol, as the term was used by Freud in the analysis of dreams and art, is any temporal or spatial pattern which is reinforcing because of similarity to another pattern, but escapes punishment because of differences. Thus, an abstract sculpture is symbolic of the human form, if it is reinforcing because of resemblances, and if the artist would, in the absence of punishment, have emphasized the resemblances. A musical composition symbolizes sexual behavior, if it is reinforcing because of a similarity in temporal pattern, and if it is omitted in place of such behavior, because it is different enough to escape punishment. So we can reason that the symbol, even with its dualistic nature, is a pattern that we can't recognize exactly, nor understand whence the resemblances come from, yet it has a reinforcing influence on us and our behavior. But before we delve into behaviorism, let's consider other dominant theories. Today there are three primary schools of thought when it comes to psychology: cognitive, behavioral, and psychodynamic. At first glance, all of them seem very distinct. Behaviorism dismisses internal states. Psychodynamic theories focuses on unconscious motivations and drives, and cognitive on mental processes. But it's interesting to see how each is related to each other. For example, behaviorism has some parallels with psychodynamic theories in explaining phenomena, as Skinner puts it. The person may correctly identify the variables controlling his behavior, and in doing so, he advances toward a rule which would govern similar behavior if the original contingencies were defective or lacking. He may be wrong, however. He may invent a set of variables. He's particularly likely to do so if the actual variables are grounds for punishment. This is rationalization in the Freudian sense. Even the idea of the unconscious is being addressed. Conscious versus unconscious, since it is often the function of a rule to identify stimuli responses and their consequences, reasoned behavior is marked by reflection and awareness. Freud assigned contingency-shaped behavior to the unconscious. Presumably, one must be conscious of one's own behavior either to discover a rule or to follow one. Today, we can see how cognitive scientists are trying to get away from unconscious as a term, trying to get away from psychoanalytic notions like repression, wishes, and symbols, and focus on not conscious processing such as playing guitar without thinking. But we can recall what Piaget said about psychodynamic theories. Freud's theory is too well known to require a lengthy restatement before we proceed to examine how far it can serve as an explanation of unconscious symbolism. It must be emphasized that Freud's contribution is essentially a new technique, and that although his theoretical conceptions now require a general overhaul, this technique continues to be the only systematic method so far discovered of exploring the unconscious schemas. We get into murky grounds when one considers that repression in behaviorism has been defined as fear of punishment emitting an operant behavior, and yet the cognitive approach tries to get away from psychoanalytical concepts such as repression, but is simultaneously close to behaviorism. And who hasn't heard about cognitive behavioral therapy flowing around? As behaviorism seems to hold its ground strong in both schools of thought, as both acknowledge the influence of the environment, how does this framework reflect in the film? Ivan Pavlov, who was one of the pioneers of the behaviorist movement, introduced the world to conditioning in 1903 at Congress of Natural Sciences in Helsinki. He conceptualized a model called conditioned reflex, which was conditioned through his research on dogs. He noticed how dogs were salivating when the guard would show up even though they were not carrying any food with them. This led him to his theory of associations, which is more than intuitive. His model says that unconditioned stimulus, which causes unconditioned response, paired up with a conditioned stimulus gives us conditioned response when conditioned stimulus is presented. Essentially, there's an establishment of stimulus and response connection. This is exactly how we see the Pavlovian theory being applied in the film. The Pavlovian conditioning that we see is related to Alex's treatment.
What exactly is the treatment here going to be then?
It's quite simple, really. We're just going to show you some films.
You mean like going to the pictures?
Something like that.
But if we enlarge this phenomenon, we see that the Pavlovian model of stimulus and response is embedded everywhere. If we break down the character only based on the film, we can see how conditioning was working with symbols. Symbols such as milk, phallus, Beethoven, snake, and masks are varieties of stimulus that are paired up with violence and promiscuity. But this poses an interpretive problem. Its associations in pairing are mostly established through repetition. Our pairing is based on our own response to a stimulus, rather than the characters. This creates ambivalence around the symbol itself, as we cannot derive all variables which are related to a particular stimulus in relation to Alex's life. Through this ambivalence, we compare our response with the film's portrayed response. We associate Beethoven with Ode to Joy and Brotherliness, which is reflected in Europe, and Alex with violence.
As I slew shit, I knew such lovely pictures.
However, we can still generalize stimulus and response based on perceived association of them in the film. The treatment aims to pair violence and sex to another stimulus, an injection that causes nausea, which consequently makes the patient nauseous when reacting to violence and sex. But we also see him feeling nauseous when he tries to act. So the Pavlovian associations don't reflect the actual shaping of human behavior that we see. It is more common to use the Pavlovian principles in more reactive behavior, where there's not much voluntary control. As Alex has control over his behavior to a degree, it's obvious that the acquisition of the required behavior involves not only stimulus and response. Burroughs Frederick Skinner proposed a different model of conditioning for explaining and shaping behavior. The relationship between stimulus and response is heavily reliant on the consequence, which we see more often in the film than the pairing of sickness with violence. All behavior is based on these three-term contingencies: antecedent, behavior, and consequence.
Other patient packs the ball back across the table If it goes past one pigeon, the other pigeon can eat, and if it goes the other way, the other pigeon eats. So that there is it's a real game. The pigeon is reinforced for a cross-court shot if that is what gets the ball past his opponent.
When it comes to consequences, Skinner discussed reinforcement and punishment. When it comes to reinforcement, he distinguished two types, positive and negative. Positive reinforcement causes the probability of behavior to increase due to a subsequent desirable consequence. So Alex's behavior was reinforced by monetary rewards and sexual pleasure. Negative reinforcement is related to a behavior that increases due to removal of an unpleasant consequence. In this film, we can see how this is reflected. Alex's removal of the negative consequence, sickness, increases the probability that he will refrain from acting violently in situations that arise in which he previously would have acted so. Reinforcement can also be secondary, which means that it relates to the primary, more biological reinforcer. So if we consider the Freudian view, monetary reinforcer can serve as a secondary reinforcer to sexual pleasure. If we consider the Nietzschean view, or for that matter the Adlerian, secondary reinforcement that is generalized, for example seeking for domination, is more prominent than biological primary reinforcers. Punishment is introduction of unpleasant consequence to reduce the probability of selected behavior. This way of shaping behavior is not an effective means to control, as Skinner himself put it. Control through punishment may also have unforeseen effects upon operant behavior. The process of self-control miscarries when the individual discovers ways of avoiding aversive self-stimulation, which prove eventually to be ineffective, troublesome, or dangerous. So we can see why the treatment was ineffective. Alex's behavior was constantly being punished. After the treatment, he got kicked out of his home. After giving money to a homeless guy, he got beaten. Also, he got beaten by officers who used to be his friends but betrayed him. His identification of stimulus, response, and consequence was itself a punishment, as he witnessed how the violent behavior of his friends got them to positively reinforcing consequences in comparison to him. In these situations, if one wanted to maintain his behavior, one should have reinforced behavior with some positive reinforcers. Skinner noted that if there's a need to use punishment, we should not forget to use reinforcement in shaping required behavior. At the end of the film, we can see how Alex's situation got better the moment there was a hint of positive reinforcement and not punishment. In addition, there's also the extinguishing of associations between aversive consequences and behavior by the absence of punishment.
The boy you always quarreled with is seriously ill?
My mind is a blank. And I'll smash your face for you, Yarblocos.
Good.
The reason why things got really out of hand was when positive reinforcer, Beethoven, was accidentally paired with punishment.
It's a sin! It's a sin! It's a sin!
Sin? What's all this about sin?
That! Using Ludwig van like that! He did no harm to anyone! Beethoven just wrote music!
Are you referring to the background score?
Yes!
You've heard Beethoven before?
Yes!
So you're keen on music?
Yes!
Can't be helped. Here's the punishment element, perhaps.
Making Alex's conditioning history even more contradictory. Worth noting are aspects of punishment in the Christian belief put forward by the preacher in the prison. Finding some parallels with Freud's concept of the superego is related to communal verbal punishment and reinforcement. But one finds that through this high abstraction one can visualize and identify other elements of the story, as was the case with Alex's identification with the Roman brutalization. So when Alex was reading the Bible, he was extracting different elements of stimulus and associating them with being the cause of suffering, since these antecedents, through external conditions, already had a long history of associations.
I read all about the scourging and the crowning with thorns, and I could vidi myself helping in and even taking charge of the toll-chocking and the nailing in, being dressed in the height of Roman fashion.
In conceptualizing that there are certain tendencies or drives that reflect the dynamics of the film, we can examine what this conception of drive means. Skinner asserted that it's not a stimulus nor a state. For example, we can say that someone eats because of hunger, but hunger is just an intervening variable that unnecessarily combines various measurable variables such as hours of deprivation, types of food eaten before, and rate of metabolism. So in this film, what we see as a drive, will to power, we tend to just generalize variables to help us explain Alex's behavior. But does it really help? The commonest inner causes have no specific dimensions at all, either neurological or psychic. When we say that a man eats because he is hungry, smokes a great deal because he has the tobacco habit, fights because of the instinct of pugnacity, behaves brilliantly because of his intelligence, or plays the piano well because of his musical ability, we seem to be referring to causes. But on analysis, these phrases prove to be merely redundant descriptions. Terms as hunger, habit, and intelligence convert what are essentially the properties of a process into what appear to be things. Thus, we are unprepared for the properties eventually to be discovered in the behavior itself and continue to look for something which may not exist. Today, especially in the online world, it's worth considering how many causes are attributed to widely descriptive statements, on which depends such a variety of interpretations that the descriptive statements lose their value altogether. To make it a Bantan example of what this means in today's society, let's take a look at one of the case studies. A YouTube channel under a pseudonym Moon provides a commentary around films. This commentary reflects on the film and its role in society, as if it made a prediction about the society and presents a few case studies, the essence of which is to show a view of control that comes from the outside, helplessness that comes with it, and using strong words such as freedom, free will, and mind. To take one example which reflects the author's approach, we can see how far-stretching the assumptions are.
The general idea is to control people by subliminally pushing them towards certain behaviors, more in line with the state's ideals. The idea came from a relatively new field of study called behavioral economics, which teaches that most people are stupid, short-sighted, and incapable of making the right choices for themselves, although they use the word irrational to make it easier to swallow.
Good morning!
Morning! Good morning!
Oh, and in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
Don't we know from neuroimaging methods, but also case studies in the psychological setting, that people don't really behave through reason? Didn't our so-called rationality lead us to believe that it is in an aftermath of some other underlying process? A behaviorist would say we don't recognize exactly all variables that influence our behavior, and rationality is something that causes one to see a rule behind environmental contingencies. This author can be a prime example. From his A Clockwork Orange commentary, we can see how polarizing marketing strategy, us versus them positioning, is being reinforced by outside influences. His positive reinforcement is attention, and behavior is his commentary that is based on positioning his viewers against something or someone, whether the government or society. This, of course, falls under rational terms, as he recognizes what stimulus wreaks havoc and gets attention. But there are some aspects that he doesn't recognize. One, to give you an analogy, is that his position puts the audience in Alex's place when he is forced to suffer whilst listening to Beethoven. Meaning, as there is always pitting of the audience against something or someone, he reinforces his audience more and more to be trapped in the hypothetical room and have no way out, as there will always exist someone that you can put in a category of them, such as government, society, matrix, or any other. One can look at the learned helplessness concept developed by Martin Seligman. It says when there is no way out of the situation that is followed by aversive consequences, one stops attempting anything at all that could help avoid punishment, even when there's no punishment present anymore. Making them always aversive in every situation isn't a solution. Second, as it positions an individual against somebody, it diverts attention from the individual's most appropriate circumstances, personal ones. Also, despite this channel's rationalization, he misses one important pattern when analyzing the film. Government looks for a way to control criminals, and the writer questions its methods, calls it inhuman.
Are you not the poor victim of this horrible new technique?
Yes, sir. That's exactly who I am, what I am, sir. A victim, sir.
And by God, you've been sent here by Providence. Tortured in prison, then thrown out to be tortured by the police. My heart goes out to you, poor boy.
However, it's worth considering that in the film, the worst side effects of conditioning were produced by the writer, who was fighting for a humanistic approach, as he was the one that caused Alex's attempt at suicide. Take this as another analogy, and we've got a resemblance of properties between the film's commentary and film's contingencies. Alex is the audience that watches the video of the analysis of the film. The government, or they, are clearly trying to control that audience. And the author, an established humanitarian, just like the author of the commentary, eventually is the one that abuses the methodology he himself criticized, which is reflected by reinforcing variables of the creator. I'm not disagreeing with someone's side at attempts of control, but I am agreeing to confessions. This film can reflect various aspects of society, as three-term contingencies, antecedent, behavior, and consequence are always present. But one should pay more attention to individual contingencies that are subject to control and measure. Identifying patterns of the environment of others is one thing, but recognizing them in oneself is quite another. So, Droogs, what is your antecedent, behavior, and consequence? What do you think is mine?